So what I'm going to talk about today is called The Thief in Paradise. We're getting close to where Passover week is approaching. The sacrificed lamb, Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits. You're going to have to forgive me for coughing, but we're going to talk about what happened. What happens when you die? Why did Jesus pick the thief, that particular person, to go to paradise with him? What is paradise? We're going to talk about all that. And the reason that it had to happen, because it was preordained from Genesis that it would happen this way. And nothing God does is accidental or incidental. It's planned. God sees the end from the beginning. So that means before the thing even starts, it's already over in God's mind. That's hard for us to understand because we live linearly. God lives omnipresent, which means He's there at the beginning and end at the same time. We won't ever figure that out until we get there to talk to Him. So, first verse, we're going to keep this in mind. Matthew 18:16. In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word will be established. That means you need 2 witnesses at minimum to make something true. Okay? Just keep that in mind. That's a biblical rule. It's that way when you have to come against somebody in judgment or to verify something. There has to be 2 witnesses in Revelation. The very first thing that was created, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? We know this verse. In the Hebrew, there's a word in the middle right there that's not translated into English. I've talked about this a lot, but we're going to go over it real quick. It's the Aleph and the Tav. The Aleph and the Tav is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In Greek, it's Alpha and Omega. We read Jesus say, I'm Alpha and Omega in the New Testament, but that's because we're reading the Greek version. But he actually would have said, I'm the Aleph and the Tav. And what that means is that encompasses the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, the first alphabet. So it's every word that was ever spoken is encompassed by that meaning. Aleph Tav means the word. So in any Hebrew Bible, it'll say, in the beginning God created the word, and then the heavens and the earth. So the first thing created was the word of God. And then remember that, the first thing created was the word, and then from the word, everything else was created. Does that make sense? Yes. So God created the vessel, which ultimately became Jesus, and then Jesus created everything. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him, nothing was made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. So the very first thing that was created was the Word. Eventually the Word becomes flesh and becomes who? Right. So this is an interactive lesson. You guys are going to have to talk. So, first thing created was Christ, the Word, and then the heavens and the earth were created. Now, why did He create those 2 things first? Takes 2 things to make something true. All through the Old Testament, you see this. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessings and cursings. So choose life in order that you may live and your descendants. But notice how this is Moses talking here. The witnesses that he called was heaven and earth. So heaven and earth, the first 2 material things created, are bearing witness of what Moses is saying. Right? So God creates the Word, Jesus first. The first thing Jesus creates are the witnesses. Get it? Those two things Jesus created first were going to be called throughout the entire Old Testament to witness for whatever is going on. And look it up. It shows up a lot, doesn't it? I call heaven and earth to bear witness on whatever they're going to talk about. That's important. So remember, there always has to be two witnesses to make something true. And heaven and earth was always called the divine and the human. Heaven and earth. So we're going to talk about the crucifixion and how it relates with this. When Jesus is on the cross, he is hanging there with two people beside him. Probably, more than likely, there was a lot of people on crosses. This was a Roman form of punishment. These weren't the only three people to ever be crucified. In the days of Spartacus, people have seen that movie, but that's an actual event. 6,000 people were crucified on the road in Rome. Because it was an uprising of slaves, and so they had so many people to crucify, they didn't have enough crosses. So they hung people on crosses, waited for them to die, pried them off, and nailed the next person up. So people had to sit around waiting for somebody to die on a cross to get hung up there on it. Sometimes they hung people on crosses just for a few days or a few hours, depending on the punishment. It was a form of punishment. And the Romans didn't invent crucifixion, by the way. It was the Persians, the Iranians. And we'll talk about a little bit more of that later, but the Persians invented crucifixion. Romans perfected it. Luke 23, 39 through 42. Then one of the criminals who was hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other one answering, rebuking him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing that you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justify, for we receive the due rewards of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus and said, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." This was an important event because the one thief was just looking out for himself. Save you, prove that you're God, and then if you are, save me. Which is the point of view of most Christians today. Prove that you are Jesus by giving me something. Right? The other guy just said, "Hey, Lord, when you get to where you're going, just think of me. All I want you to do is remember me." And the word remember in Hebrew means to speak on my behalf. Basically what he was saying is, Jesus, when you get to where you're going, just say my name to somebody else. Say, "Hi, I remember Claude. I remember in Fluggo, Phyllis. They was hanging there with me." That's all he wanted. He didn't want anything, but just know my name. That's a powerful statement. That statement made Jesus answer with, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So that's what we're going to focus on, is what happened right there. A lot of people will think that the thief was the first person saved, but he wasn't. Before Jesus was even led up the hill to be crucified, he took the place of Barabbas. Right? Barabbas was supposed to be punished that day, and Jesus took his place. Now, if you think about this, Bar, Abba. Bar means son of. Abba means father. So Barabbas' name means son of the father. So the son of the father took the place of the son of the father, human-wise. Heaven took the place of earth there and set him free. So that's not a coincidence. Talk a little bit about crucifixion for a second. This is more accurate of how crucifixion was. They would nail heels into the side of a cross, not the Catholic way of where their feet are over top of each other and the nail goes through both. And that goes back to Genesis 3, where God is talking to Adam and Eve and the serpent, and he says to the serpent, "You are cursed. One day you will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head." Well, right there, the heels are bruised. And it just so happens that the crucifixion happened on Golgotha, which is where the skull of Goliath was placed. Golgotha, Goliath of Gath. And he was a descendant of the seed of Satan. So Jesus crushed the head of Satan on the cross as his heels were bruised by the nails. Archaeological evidence of what I was talking about. This is an actual bone there with a nail in it. The Romans were very prestigious and resourceful people. They didn't waste anything. And if you notice, this is a cast, but this is a heel bone. And there's the nail. Went through the heel, and they think it hit a knot in the wood, so it bent. And when they were trying to pry it out, they couldn't pry the nail out, so they're like, just cut the guy's foot off. We'll keep the rest of the cross. And this was found in a bone box. So this is proof that's how they nailed people to the cross. World War I started with the Armenian Genocide. Have anybody ever heard of that? That's what the Ottoman Empire, which was made up of Muslims, Arabs, persecuting Christians. And what they did, they crucified them. This is an actual picture. They would hang people up on crosses. Turkey was the head of the Ottoman Empire. They deny that this happened, but we got pictures of it. Today, this picture is kind of gross, but this was taken in the Middle East. They still crucify people. That guy's obviously been dead a while because he's all bloated, but the concept is there. The hanging on the cross with the sign above it. Remember, they put a sign above Jesus' head saying King of the Jews. They still do this. But let's go back to that moment, because you got to think about the thief here for a second. He was on a cross too. The cross wasn't just for Jesus. Okay? So a lot of Christians can get into where we worship the cross. The cross was an instrument of death. That would be like somebody shooting your son and you carrying around a picture of a gun on your chest. Right? We don't want to worship the cross. We want to understand it. We don't worship things. We want to worship what happened on it. Right? The sacrifice that happened on it. And this is when Jesus was saying to the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And then we have this image of paradise looking like this. Right? This is a modern vision of paradise. It's pretty, but that's not what paradise was. Paradise was not heaven. They did not go to heaven. Right? If you read the story, on the third day when Jesus rises, he sees Mary. Mary goes to run after him and he says, "Oh, don't touch me, because I have not yet seen my Father. I haven't been there yet." That means he didn't go yet. So they didn't go to heaven. Where did they go? Jesus took him to paradise. So let's explain what paradise is. We got to go back to Genesis. Paradise is described in the Bible. Out of the ground, the Lord made to grow every tree that is pleasant to sight, good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the tree of life is where? In the Garden of Eden. Right? That's what it says. And every other tree. So when we go to Revelation, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. So if the tree of life is in the Garden of Eden, and he calls it paradise, that means the Garden of Eden was paradise. Does that make sense? Using the Bible to define itself. If you look up in the Strong's, paradisios, which means paradise, an ancient Persian word meaning enclosure, garden, or park. Park, garden, paradise. So it's a garden. Paradise is actually the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden got corrupted, and Adam was kicked out of the garden. Right? They disobeyed God, and God had to expel them from the garden. Genesis 3:24, so he drove out the man that he had placed, and he had placed at the east in the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every which way to keep him from the tree of life. It says, no one really knows what it looks like, but I always think this picture is probably kind of accurate, because you have over here Eden, the paradise of God, and then this rift right here, and then they're being kicked out into the world. So was it punishment or mercy? God kicked them out of the garden so they wouldn't get to the tree of life. In this particular state, God tells them in Genesis 3, okay, now that you've done this, eventually the seed of the woman is going to be born. Okay? This whole story of the Messiah now has to play out. Okay? Somebody is going to have to sacrifice themselves to fix this. We can do animal sacrifices to kick the can down the road, but eventually a Messiah will need to come and correct all this. Until that happens, get out of my house, because I need to protect you. God was protecting Adam and Eve, because if they made it back to the tree of life, they would have lived forever in a state of sin. They would have lived forever in a state of disobedience and never had a way back to God. That's why God removed them from the garden and then put swords there that nobody could go back in. Right? We know eventually that paradise became Abraham's bosom, where all of the souls of the Old Testament prophets went. They went to either a place called hell, which is called Sheol or Hades, depending on whatever language you're speaking. But Sheol is the grave. We'll talk about that. But if you think about this, the only way to get back in now to this Abraham's bosom was to die. If you're dead and you die, it won't matter that you get to the tree of life because you've already died. And then your soul lives forever anyway. So who was the first person back in paradise? It was Abel. The son of the first Adam was placed back into paradise to take care of it until the second Adam, the son of the Father, could redeem it. This is a modern map of Jerusalem today. This is the Temple Mount. Here's the Mount of Olives. This is east. This is the Kidron Valley, because it goes down here. The other side, this is a valley here, which is called the Central Valley, or they call it the Valley of the Cheesemongers. The temple would have set right here, actually, in this area right here. A lot of people think the temple was up here, but that's not true. It's right here. This was the Roman fort. And then this is the Hinnom, or the Gehenna Valley right here. And that day, in the day of the Old Testament, this valley of Gehenna or Hinnom was called hell. It was a city dump. Once a city dump on Jerusalem's south side, it was also known by Jewish kings sacrificed their sons to idols. It became a symbol of God's judgment to the Jews after Babylon invaded from what is now Iraq and erased their nation from the map. Now this is where they would set up statues of Molech. Have I heard of him? Do not let your babies or your children pass through the fires of Molech. That's what God told the Israelites before you even go in. After you come out of Egypt, before you even cross the river, do not do what they're doing. What they would do is, this is a big bronze statue, Molech, also known as Baal. They would light a fire inside of him, and it would get so hot, and they would set the babies in his hands and cook the babies. And if you notice these people standing around with trumpets, they had trumpets and drums banging so you couldn't hear the screams of the babies. Right? This is an abomination in God's eyes. It's the same thing as abortion. So this would happen in that valley. So it was the valley of death. So that's where David was saying, if I ascend to heaven, you are there, and if I make my bed in hell, you are there. He was talking about that valley because to them it was a literal physical place they could see and they could smell. And so it became a valley of death. Right? A physical example of the spiritual that would go on later. So hell in the minds of those ancient Hebrews was not only a metaphorical or a spiritual place, it was a literal place where people went and sacrificed their babies to an idol god. So we'll talk a little bit about the Sheol, because in the Old Testament this is the word for hell. It's the grave. And there are two places in hell that you could be a part of depending on who you were, how you died, how you lived, what happened in your death. Because the people, if you take Moses, we know Moses obeyed God. Ezekiel, Isaiah, all these Old Testament prophets, Jeremiah, they did what they were supposed to. They couldn't go to heaven because there was no Messiah yet. But they had to go somewhere, and they weren't going to go someplace of torment. God wasn't going to punish them like that. So they would have had to go someplace that was acceptable to wait until they could hear the gospel. Luke 16:22-33. And it came to pass that when a beggar died, he was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and in hell lifted up his eyes, being tormented, and he sees Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. So these two places are close enough where you could see, but there is a gulf or a rift between them, a separation that could not be bridged. He could see Abraham's bosom or paradise, and if you think back of that picture where Adam and Eve are leaving, and then there's this crack in the ground, they could see, but they couldn't get back to it because it was protected. So that shows there's two places in hell, right? Two chambers. One for the righteous, one for the not righteous. Does that make sense? Now this is nothing. Hell is not on fire. That's a lake of fire. That's in Revelation of what hell is cast into. So when people say they die and they go to hell, they're not burning. They're in a holding place until judgment. Then death and hell are cast into the lake of fire. Right? So someone dies, now they're not going to a lake of fire. No. That's at the end, after the judgment. Does that make sense? Everyone dies and rests in Sheol until the resurrection. That's the grave. The word Sheol appears 65 times in the Hebrew Bible. King James translates 31 times as hell. Translates it 31 times as the grave, and 3 times as the pit. That equals the 65 times. So they're talking about the same place. Grave, hell, grave, and the pit are the same place. The scriptures teach that there are 2 chambers in Sheol. One chamber is called Abraham's bosom. Another chamber is called Hades or hell. In Hebrew, Gehenna or Henna, that valley. The question often asked is, when people died in the Old Testament, where did they go? The answer is, those who trusted God to eventually save them through a Messiah went to Abraham's bosom. Those who rejected God's promise of the coming Messiah went to Sheol, Hades, or hell. And then they're separated, like that rich man could see. Across the gulf are the people who believed there will be a Messiah. And over here in the darkness, that's why he says, if you could just give me a drop of water, which is a revelation, give me back one chance to believe. Right? And we don't, once you're dead, you're in an eternal state at that point. You're forever. Your body is gone, but your soul lives forever. So where your soul lives would be, you might want to say that, would it be worse to live forever being on fire, or to live forever knowing you will never see God? Knowing that I had a chance to walk up to my King, Christ, and I blew it, and I will never see him. That's the importance of death. That's the only thing that brings us back into communion with God. So when people die, and they say, why is God so mean? If he's a God of love, why did he let somebody die? Well, he's a God of love because sin is in the world, and without death we will never be in right communion with him again. We will always be separated. If we live forever like this, we would be separated from him. It's a scary thought, isn't it? This is how Jerusalem looked at the time of Christ. That Dome of the Rock would be right about here, right now. Al-Aqsa is right here. This would be the western wall right here. In those days, this was the Roman fort, Fort Antonia. Over here is a bridge, and this is the temple that Herod helped build. And then you go down these steps, and then you're in the city of David. You see the bridge down there at the bottom? That bridge goes over to the Mount of Olives, right here. So during the Passover time, the priests are up here getting everything ready for the sacrifices. So the priests would, after they got all the sacrifice lambs killed and prepped for Passover, he would leave and go through here across the valley to the Mount of Olives, where there would be wheat and barley and all these different things growing, but at that time it would be barley. And he would go up and try to find the best stalks of barley, and he would wrap them and say, I have marked this one, and I have marked this one. No one is to touch this barley. I need to seclude myself after I've marked these. And then when I come back on the day of first fruits, I am going to gather these barley things that I have marked. And I am going to offer them to God, because they are going to be the first fruit. So he would mark them, tie them off. And then everyone knew, do not touch those that the priest has marked. He's going to give those to God. Does that make sense? This is part of the first fruit offering. Eventually your wave offering would come from those things. And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection. And they went into the city and appeared to many people. A lot of people misread this, and they think when Jesus died, all these zombies got up out of the ground and started walking around. No, that's not what happened. It says when he died, graves were opened. They were marked. These were Old Testament saints. So their caskets were split open. When I come back, I'm going to grab that one. I'm going to grab that one. I'm going to grab him. I'm going to grab her. Then when he arose, those that had been marked came out of the ground too. Right? There was a short amount of time that Jesus, when he came out of the tomb, he interacted with a few people before he went to heaven. Mary sees him. It's still dark, by the way, because he rises at sunset. Still dark. She gets there. It says that in the Bible. It's still dark. She didn't even recognize him because it was dark. And he tells her, she goes to hug him. He says, oh, don't touch me yet, because I have not yet been to my Father. Right? I haven't ascended. If someone would have touched the high priest on his way back across the bridge with his barley, he would have been unclean, and then he would have to go baptize again and purify himself, and then he would waste the morning doing that. Right? So everyone knew that when the priest comes out of his prayer seclusion, everybody stay clear of him until he's made his first fruit offering. You can't even touch him. You can't touch his robe until he has become one with God with the best he had to offer. Make sense? So Jesus marked the best that he had to offer from the entire Old Testament. All of those guys, Moses, Abraham, Samson, all these guys were marked. And then Mary goes to touch him. He's like, hey, hang on. You can't touch me yet, because I am now the high priest, and I have to take my first fruit offering up to my Father. She takes off running and goes back to tell the people he's up. And then when he appears to them later, what does he say to them? Go ahead and touch me. Since you've been running back, I've already gathered up all the Old Testament saints and delivered them up to my Father in heaven at his temple. And then he comes back down. Now he's back down, and that thief would have been one of those. That thief was the first New Testament guy to be offered up with the Old Testament guys. It's a pretty cool thought, isn't it? Jesus talked about the same thing we talked about earlier. Is it also written in your law that the testimony of two men is true? Again, two things need to make something true. Jesus says, I am one that bears witness of myself. My Father that has sent me bears witness of me. This is when he's talking on earth to humans that are alive. God the Father is the heaven witness. Jesus at this point is human. He's the earth witness of himself. There's two witnesses. So when he says, my Father bears witness to me, so I'm telling you this is true. You can believe me, because I have two witnesses. This is something Jesus taught. Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming to which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. I can myself do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of my Father who sent me. Now listen to this. This is Jesus' words. If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. There is another who bears witness of me, and I know that the witness which he witnesses of me is true. So Jesus says, if I bear witness of myself, it's not true. You can't trust it. You have to have somebody else witness for me. You know, whether it be John the Baptist or the dove or the voice from heaven. Does that make sense? And Jesus is talking to these people who know they won't believe nothing until two things verify it. Jesus says, I am he that liveth and was dead. And behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. For I have the keys of hell, Sheol, death, and the grave. So he owns that. How did he get that? He had to go take it. In Ezekiel, there was a prophecy, and he shall know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves, O my people, and have brought you up out of your graves. There was a prophecy fulfilled. So in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, everything is established. We got that? Jesus is on the cross. He's getting ready to die. He had to go get the keys of hell from the grave. He had to conquer the grave. In order to do that, he had to be in the grave. In that grave is Abraham's bosom. You have 4,000 years of Old Testament saints. Everybody from Adam, Moses, Noah, all of the judges, Samuel, David, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Think all these people who grew up knowing this rule had to have 2 witnesses. So in order for Christ to go down to Abraham's bosom to teach these people the gospel, he had to have a witness. He had to take somebody with him. In order for him to go into paradise and win over these souls, he had to take somebody with him. He couldn't have just showed up and walked up to Moses and said, "Hey, Moses, when you said there's one coming after me that you must listen to, who is like me, that's me." Moses, knowing this rule, would have said, "Prove it. I don't know you." But there was a thief there who was also hanging next to Jesus. He had the same point of view as Christ did. He was on a cross, right next to him. He was close enough that when they were probably nailing him to their cross, some of that blood got on him. He would have seen them casting lots for his robes. He had the same perspective of the crowd Jesus did. So he was one who knows what it was like to be crucified. He recognized him as the Messiah on the cross. Enough to say, "Hey man, just remember me. Right? I trust you because I can tell you are the Messiah." And Jesus said, "I can use you. I need a warrior to go with me, and you're it. You're going to go help me prove to all these Old Testament people that I am who they said I would be." They laid out prophecies for thousands of years about me, and I need you to verify it for me. The witness for Jesus. It's pretty heavy. You got to think about it. So when Jesus goes down, and you think about it, he goes into Abraham's bosom, and he walks up to Abraham and says, "Abraham, remember that ram that was stuck in the thicket? Well, that was me. I was the sacrifice. I was the substitute sacrifice for your son." Right? And Abraham, knowing the rule, would have been like, "How do I know that?" So at this point, Jesus is now divine. He died. He became divine. He became the heaven witness. He needed a human earth witness. So that's why he took the thief. So heaven and earth were getting ready to go into the grave together. So Jesus could have talked the whole story, and then this thief would have walked up to Isaiah and said, "Hey man, do you remember when you talked about by his stripes we are healed? I saw him. I was right there. Some of that blood from that stripe hit me." He walked up to Zechariah and said, "You prophesied about a king coming into the city on a donkey. This guy right here did it. I saw it. I was there." He would have walked up to Moses and said, "Moses, You talked about there was going to be one coming after you that was just like you, that would obey the law completely and fulfill it. And then remember the Passover lamb thing you did? That was him. I was there when the priest killed the Passover lamb on the Temple Mount the moment he closed his eyes. I saw it. I was there, Moses. I saw what you saw. And he could have went to David and said, David, you talked about his side being ripped open where he could count his bones. And you talked about them casting lots for his robe. I was on the cross. I watched them. I seen that. That thing you said was going to happen with him, I seen it. I was there. And David would have said, there's my second witness. I believe you. Does that make sense? He would have went up to Samuel and said, Samuel, you said God was going to raise up a faithful priest. This guy lived his entire life sinless. Imagine that. This guy was there to win over the souls of those who knew to look for a second witness. Jeremiah talked about a new covenant. And he would have walked up to Jeremiah and said, man, that covenant you talked about, I watched him make it. I was there when it happened. I watched him sign the covenant in his blood. That's why this guy went. And I believe, with all my heart, that Adam was there. We all know Adam sinned, but I believe Adam made himself right. How could you not? How could you not? You were the only human to ever be perfectly made. And he gave it up. Imagine how bad that felt. So Adam probably felt horrible. He was there in Abraham's bosom the longest with all these Old Testament saints. And all of them were like, dude, we're here because you. He was probably sitting off in a corner somewhere. But I believe he made himself right. There's actually a book, about Adam and Eve after. It's not a canon Bible, but it talks about Adam trying to redeem himself by standing in the Jordan River for 40 days to cleanse himself as a baptism. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But it's an old, back, those people in the Old Testament believed that. So the thief would have sought out Adam and said, hey, Adam, I know you feel bad probably for starting all this. But I'm here to tell you that I know it was a thief in the garden that stole paradise from you. And now the second Adam has come down with a thief to tell you he's just redeemed it back. A thief stole paradise from Adam. So the second Adam took a thief back to paradise to get it back. That was the importance of that guy. There is no longer any souls in Abraham's bosom because Jesus emptied it. His Hebrew name is Yeshua, which means salvation. He saved them. When the faithful believer in God dies now, they ascend to the bosom of the Messiah. Now they don't go to the new heaven yet. You're with Christ. And he is taking care of you until the end. Until the new heaven and new earth and all that stuff happens. That's what happens when we die. Either you're going to Sheol or hell or the holding place or the grave, or you're in the arms of the Messiah. So all these people that you see dying now, if you know that they're dying in the right place, they're being held by Christ in his bosom until it's time to come get everybody else, and then we're with him forever. So the importance of that is, as much as we know Christ is divine, we know God the Father is all powerful. He's so powerful we can't even comprehend the beginning of that. But in order to make all this work for everybody else, think about this. In order for all those people that were marked in their graves, in order to make that work, Christ needed help from a human as a witness. Jesus could win anybody over. But we are to be the person, that thief. We are the earth witness to everybody out there. Jesus can appear to them and say, I'm the Messiah, but they need a second witness. They need us. That's how important we are to this ministry. That's what we are. We are the ones, we say we win people over. You know, Ida goes to McDonald's. She's being that second witness. And sometimes we are the first witness. We talk to the people and we share with them what we know. And then they go seek out God and He verifies what we said. And that two witness makes it true. Has anybody ever heard of somebody saying, man, you told me something and then I saw it. And then it came to pass. Or you said something to me. Somebody prophesied to me and then it came true. There's your two witnesses. But that's how important we are to this ministry. Jesus, at the very moment of conquest, of conquering, He still needed somebody, a human, to help Him. Because of this rule. It takes two witnesses. So, all you need, He's always going to be a righteous, good witness. And we need to be that other witness. We need to tell people, hey man, this is what I saw. I was there when it happened. And if it wasn't for that thief recognizing Messiah on the cross and not asking for anything and not being the first evangelist to go down with Christ, none of those people would have ever bought it. Because they knew the rule. But because He was faithful and Jesus was faithful, every one of them guys came out and was walking around Jerusalem being a witness. That's how important it is. So that's the importance of the thief, even though it's not talked about that much and we don't even know his name. But we don't need to, because you insert your name in that spot. That's why that blank space is there. It's for you to put your name in there and be that witness.